All right, so welcome to Anatomy and Physiology. Now, anatomy and physiology are very closely integrated topics, but yet they're distinct from one another as well. And so when we look at anatomy, and we look at, what are these things right here? Lungs. Woo, you already know anatomy. Cool. Lungs. So anatomy of our respiratory system, for instance, it's basically going to be identification. It's going to be, what is it? Where is it? And as you go into your lab, you're going to learn a lot about what is it adjacent to? What is it close to? Within what quadrant of the body will you find certain organs? That's anatomy. And so in our illustration, we have our trachea that divides into two bronchi, that divide into secondary bronchi, and so on and so forth until we get down to the alveoli of the lungs where gas exchange occurs. We also have the diaphragm, the muscular basement of your thoracic cavity. That divides abdominal from thoracic. So that's all anatomy, anatomical terms. But I think you would agree you have to understand some basic anatomy before you can understand the physiology. So our respiratory system, what's the physiology? Well, how does the contraction of the diaphragm, contraction of the intercostal muscles that change the shape of the thoracic cavity, how does that impact lung volume? It causes them to expand, and when they expand, you inhale because of lower pressure created inside the lungs versus the pressure in the atmosphere. That's physiology. So identity, anatomy, function is the key word for physiology. Now we're going to be covering both in our A&P 1 class. So there's some of those terms that we've already used. Pneumo, what does pneumo mean? See that? Pneumocytes? What does the term pneumo mean? Have you ever heard pneumo before? Huh? I thought somebody say pneumonia. Yeah, what's pneumonia? Yes, infection of the lungs. Pneumo means lungs. So a lot of the terms that you're going to hear are going to be Latin or Greek derived terms that mean certain things, and they will be heard again and again. Site. You ever seen that word before? Site. What is sites? Cells. So pneumo, lung, sites. What kind of cells are those? Cells in the lungs. See, it's not that hard. It's really not that hard. Now, we have a couple of different types of pneumocytes, and when you get into your histology, you'll cover some of those. Now, we're not going to do a ton of histology in here. They're going to be doing that in lab. But if you have any questions about histology, again, I teach the senior pre-med course about histology, so I'll be a resource for that as well. What about the heart? Look at anatomy. You've got the chambers. How many chambers does a human heart have? 4. Good. Why am I here? Y'all already know it. I'll go home. 4. We've got the septa. That's what divides the heart into those 4 chambers. The heart is my favorite organ in the body, and unfortunately, that's an A&P 2. Your early development, your heart was 2 blood vessels on the sides of your body. That's when you were a flat 3-layer pancake. But then as you roll up into a jelly roll, those blood vessels come together and fuse into one long tube. That's your heart. Then you have expansion into 1 atrium and then 1 ventricle. And then those have to divide into our 4 chambers, and that's where the septa come from. Valves. We know the valves can get jacked up. You have this regurgitation of blood flow, so you have to have your valves replaced. Those are all anatomical terms. But when you look at the physiology of the heart, how does the blood flow through the beating heart? How does the heart even know to contract? And we detect that on the EKG that you will be watching very closely, because if you're a nurse and you go into a room and you see this flat line, what's going to happen then? Code what? Blue. Why do they call it code blue? Why do they call it code red? I want my code red. Red means emergency, right? Why do they call it code blue? Because if your heart's not beating, you're going to turn blue. Your lips and your fingernails, those are going to be the first things that turn blue. That's called cyanosis. Again, physiology. Now, in our digestive system, this is one of the big insets in the textbook. It's kind of like a big poster. But for the digestive system, we have these long, long structures called intestines. You have about 30 feet of intestines that are divided up into different sections. What are our intestines called? What are the two big names for our intestines? Small and large, right? See, it's not that hard. Now, sometimes people call the large intestine the colon. The small intestine you can divide into three regions: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Again, that's going to be part of the histology that you'll get. But that's anatomy. When we get to the physiology, we're going to look at absorption. All the raw materials that you ingest, how does that get into the bloodstream? Once it's in the bloodstream, how are the carbohydrates metabolized? How are the fats metabolized? I wish we didn't even have to talk about the fats. They taste good, but they're bad. But that's physiology. Are you beginning to see the difference between anatomy, the what, and the physiology? Function, how it works. So, what we're largely going to do here in lecture is we're going to talk about the composition of various organs and organ systems. Now, that's the exception. That's going to be the first unit. First unit, we're going to talk largely about cells, and we'll see how that lines up with lab. But in lab, that's your identify, location, association, all the bumps, all the holes on all the bones, whether it's a right or a left, you will have to identify those features and those structures in lab. We're going to be looking at a lot of microscopic structure. This is a skeletal muscle. We're going to be looking down at the molecular level to see how these sliding proteins, when they function all together, they cause the entire muscle to contract. So we'll get to muscle, and that'll be part of our discussion. So here is an alignment of lecture and lab, just to give you an idea of how at the beginning of the semester, lecture and lab will not be lockstep together. Because in the first part, we're going to be talking about what is anatomy, physiology. We're going to talk about homeostasis. In lab, you're going to be talking terminology and then using the microscope, because you're moving into histology. We're going to be talking about chemistry, biochemistry, and then we're going to get into cell biology. It won't be until the second week of October before we get into actually organ systems. You're going to get into organ systems after your first practical in lab, which is going to be around that third week of September. Now, don't take this as gospel, because they'll give you the syllabus in lab. That was an old one I downloaded and tried to extrapolate. But here's skeletal system. See, we're not going to get to skeletal system until maybe 2 weeks after. Here's muscular system. We're getting caught up. Nervous system. So what I'm saying is by the end of the semester, we'll be caught up. But again, things are happening in the lab that are different than are happening here. But we'll eventually get in the right place, because you need all this information. All right, so chapter 1 really is, again, more or less an introduction into what we're doing as far as anatomy and physiology. As we sort of showed the comparison between lecture and lab, we are going to start looking at the atomic level. We're going to talk a little bit about chemistry. This is not a chemistry class, but we have to have a fundamental understanding of chemistry to be able to talk about the biologically important molecules and how those come together to form our organelles, cells, and such. So we start here just looking at our levels of organization. And as junior scientists, that's what I'm going to call you all, scientists love to organize things for basic understanding. We love to describe, we love to classify, we love to organize. That way we all understand exactly what we're talking about. And so for our level of organization, we have the chemical level. And we start with the smallest of our units that are significant to us, and those are going to be atoms. Now, I realize I am not a theoretical physicist, although I do watch The Big Bang Theory. There are a lot smaller particles. But the ones we're going to consider are going to be the atoms, the smallest unit of matter. Now, as we take atoms and we organize them together, we put two atoms together. Now we have a molecule, two or more atoms. Now, if these two atoms happen to be different elements, we can say like a water molecule that is hydrogen and oxygen, we can call that molecule a compound. A molecule can be the same thing like oxygen, our O2 in the atmosphere. So now if we take molecules, we put them together in certain organizations. Now we have organelles, which are compartments within cells where we can have certain specified functions. Because if you know anything about cells, you probably are aware that what happens in the nucleus is very different than what happens in the mitochondria. What's some important stuff? And that's one of my favorite scientific words, stuff. What stuff is in the nucleus? Okay, now when we're talking about the atomic nucleus, absolutely right. But let's think about cells. I kind of skipped ahead on you a little bit there. In the nucleus of a cell, what's the important stuff in there? DNA. What does DNA do? Everything, right? It's the code. It's the code for everything that you do and everything that you are. But in a mitochondria, what's happening in that organelle? You're producing energy. There's a lot of metabolism going on. And a lot of the machinery to produce energy probably wouldn't be a very hospitable environment for our DNA. Now, if we jack up the DNA in a cell, what if we potentially set the stage for that particular cell? If you mutate the DNA of a cell, that could lead to the dreaded C word, cancer. So you want to keep the DNA safe and protected. And you're going to find that your body has really unique and cool ways with which it does that. In fact, one of the easiest places, especially as we get more in our southern climates, closer to the equator, one of the easiest ways for us to damage our cells is ultraviolet radiation. And what's that going to impact first? Your skin, right? Your skin cells are dividing all the time. You're making new cells. You're losing cells on the surface, and you're making new ones. So dividing cells are particularly susceptible to ultraviolet radiation damage. Do you know how your dividing skin cells protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation? Not just your pigmentation. Your skin cells only divide at night. Did you know that? They're not dividing in the daylight hours when you could be susceptible to more damage. They only divide at night. So that's just one of the ways that our cells and the organelles within our cells are trying to protect the functions that are happening. Now let's package all the organelles together and we step up to the cellular level. And we get a cell, which is the smallest unit of life. Now that's particularly a problem because are viruses alive? Oh, I heard a yes over here and a no over here. Good, we got a debate. So when we look at life, again, biologists, biochemists have come up with some criteria for life. If you're alive, you can reproduce. Cells reproduce. We call that mitosis. For bacteria, we call it binary fission. Do viruses reproduce? They replicate, which looks a lot like reproduction, right? But viruses have to have a what to reproduce? A cell. So there are various things that make viruses go, kind of, sort of, maybe not. But it's a very specific definition. And that's, again, what scientists do, very specifically define and categorize objects. So cells, very important. You have a myriad of cells in your body. The cells that line your stomach are going to do very different things than the cells that form the neurons of your brain. One sends electrical information. It helps you think. It helps you remember. The other produces, which is kind of blows my mind, thinks about the Alien movie, right? Aliens had acid for blood. You have acid in your stomach. What kind of acid do your own cells make in your stomach? You know what the kind of acid that is? What's a very strong acid? Hydrochloric acid. Your body produces, that's kind of scary when you think about it. So your cells have very different functions, and so their structure is going to be very different. And that structure-function relationship is going to relate to size, shape, internal structure of all the different cells in your body. Now, let's package cells together. When you take differing cells and you package them together into a functional unit, we refer to this as tissues. And so when we look at our basic tissue types that are going to form the entire human body from these four types, we're going to first look at epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is going to cover, or it's going to be the lining of certain body cavities. The surface of your skin, that's epithelial tissue. The surface of your eye, epithelial tissue. The lining of your reproductive tract, epithelial tissue. Now we have some specialized epithelial tissue that you'll probably get to in the histology portion of lab. Your glandular epithelium are going to be the secretory part of that. So they call that specialized epithelium. But what I want you to remember, epithelial tissue covers. It's either going to cover on the outside or cover on the inside. I like to try to find, again, these mnemonics and similar words. So we're going to stick with the C for the function of our tissues. Muscle tissue. What's our C for muscle tissue? Contract. Muscles contract. Whether we're talking about skeletal muscles, which are attached to your skeleton. See how they got their names? Pretty cool, right? Or cardiac muscle, which contracts to move the blood through your body. Or smooth muscle that helps control blood flow in your blood vessels, or it helps move food along through your alimentary canal. So muscles contract. That's all they do. How they're arranged, what they're attached to, will dictate what kind of work that contraction can accomplish. So epithelium covers, muscles contract. Nervous tissue. Nervous tissue conducts. Nervous tissue conducts electrical activity. And when we look at nerve cells and that conduction, this wave of electrical activity that can go from your brain to your big toe, this is simply the changing of a concentration gradient of sodium and potassium ions. All your memories, all your thoughts, all of your motor activity, all of the information you are getting about the outside environment, all boils down to sodium and potassium. That kind of freaks me out. Does anybody? You are biochemical reactions. And when I think that I'm just a biological machine, I sort of get offended by that. We're bigger than that, and we're more special than that, right? But when you look at the biology of the human body and you distill it down to the basic elements, sodium and potassium are crucial. And so nervous system conducts. So we have our three types. Epithelium, what's our C? Covers. Muscle, contracts. Nervous, conducts. Now, a lot of times we're going to repeat things because the more you say it, the more you see it, the more you write it, the better you're going to remember it. Right? That repetition is the mother of remembering and understanding and learning. So I said we had four tissue types, right? The last and the fourth tissue type is everything else. So if you learn these three, you don't have to remember everything in this last one. You just go, okay, it's everything else. You see my trick? Whenever you have to remember two things and they're opposite of each other, you just really have to learn one and know the other one is the opposite. I mentioned sodium and potassium, right, with the conduction. Sodium and potassium are always, almost always, in highest concentrations in opposite areas. They almost always move in opposite directions. So if you learn one, you really got two. It's a twofer. I like getting twice as much work done with half the effort. Anybody else? Yeah, that's how I roll. So the last one is connective tissue. Now, you may think that a great C word for connective tissue would be what? Connect. No, not so much. I put completes, and when I say completes, meaning everything else. So if it's not epithelium, it's not muscle, it's not nervous, what else do we have in our body that we haven't listed? I mean, connective tissue, a lot of times we think of ligaments and tendons, all of the other stuff like collagens that hold us and connect us together. But what's something else we haven't listed? We haven't listed bones. What else? Kind of related to bones. Cartilage. We haven't listed cartilage. We don't usually think of that necessarily as connecting. What else haven't we listed? You see this if you cut yourself. Blood. What in the heck? Blood? Yeah, blood is a specialized connective tissue. So do you see why I like the completes? Connective tissue is everything else that's not in our first three categories. I mean, we're good with epithelium covers, muscle we got, nervous system, that's fairly straightforward. So just remember that biggest group, the very diverse group, if it doesn't fit the first three, it must be connective tissue. Right? Now, this is a nice example of an organ. And that's going to be our next level up. This is the stomach. You probably recognize that from middle school or high school. We've got the outside and the inside lining, which is our epithelial tissue. Situated in the middle, we have our smooth muscle. Your stomach is very good at grinding up and mushing up and kneading the food so that your hydrochloric acid and your digestive enzymes can begin to break down this material. We also have the connective tissues, such as the collagens that are holding the epithelium and the muscle together. And then we have nervous tissue, which are the neurons that tell our smooth muscle how hard to contract, in what order to contract to move the food down and throughout our alimentary canal. So you see how we have all four types represented in this one organ. So at the organ level, when we combine all these tissues, and not every organ is necessarily going to have all four components, but most will. We get to our organs, such as our stomach. And then when we add our esophagus, our intestines, we put that all together with the stomach. Now we have an organ system. So the stomach at the organ level, with its very specific function, which is the breaking down of our food, works along with our intestines, whose function is to absorb material. That's all part of our digestive system. And we're going to have about 12 or so, I think 10 or 11, depending on the picture that you look at, different organ systems in the body. And these are sort of divided out in A&P 1 and A&P 2. So this is a kind of small picture. We're going to blow this up a little bit and divide it out. So if we look at the difference, in 238, the organ systems we're going to look at are going to be the integument, which is a big fancy word for skin. Skin, hair, and nails. That's all part of the integumentary system. We're also going to cover the muscular system and the skeletal system, and a lot of your textbooks group those two together in what they call the musculoskeletal system. So that's where we either get the 10 or 11 or so. And then we're going to finish up this semester with the nervous system. Now, next semester you get to 239. You're going to cover circulatory, endocrine, immune, respiratory, urinary, digestive, and reproductive. Y'all going to be busy in 239. But you got to get through 238 before you get to 239. So do you see all the different organ systems that are involved in you accomplishing and doing everything that you do each and every day? Most of the time, totally subconsciously. Because your heart's beating. Are you thinking about that? This is sometimes where I would insert a blonde joke, but there are way too many blondes in here for me to be comfortable with that. No. Breathing. Are you thinking about breathing in? No. Many of these systems are going at the subconscious level, but they have to keep you in balance, to keep you alive, and to keep you healthy. So we've gone all the way from atoms all the way to our 10 or 11 organ systems, and when you package all of them together, now we have a completely independent, free-living organism. And the function of an organism, again, like we distilled down the conduction of our nervous system into sodium and potassium, what is the function of an organism? I'm not talking about your purpose in life. I'm not talking about the higher calling, anything like that. Just from a pure biological sense, what is the purpose of the organism? To survive long enough to reproduce. That's it. Continuation of the species. That's what we do. So all of the atoms, all of the organelles, all the cells, tissues, organs, organ systems that are packaged together into this individual, and I bet he's got coffee because it's early, survive long enough to reproduce. And that survival means you're going to get raw material in, you're going to metabolize it to provide the energy that you need to get more food, to avoid being someone else's food, long enough for you to reproduce. Now, in lab, you're going to learn a lot about orientations of the body. We talked a little bit about the quadrants. You're going to learn a lot of those and a lot of the terminology. I simply wanted to introduce a few of them here so that you can hit the ground running. Many of you had lab yesterday, right? And if you didn't yesterday, you've got it today? All right. So when we look at body positioning, and this is going to be one of the trickiest things for health professionals to do. All right? When you talk about right or left, what is it always going to be in reference to? The patient. So a lot of times if you are facing the patient, it's the opposite of your right and left. Now, if for some reason you're talking to the back of their head, I guess it's okay. But it's always relative to the patient. So everything that we're talking about as far as our three-dimensional orientations and or planes of section, it's always relative to the patient. And so when we look at front to back, you can refer to this in two different ways. Now, in the textbook and in this illustration, you have anterior and you have posterior. Now, I'm sort of an old comparative anatomist. So for me, and a lot of health professionals, technically this is ventral. And what would this then be? Dorsal. You know how I remember dorsals back here? If you're swimming and you see this fin on somebody's back sticking out of the water, what kind of fin is that? That's a dorsal fin, and what do you hope it's not? A shark. I was at Pensacola, Florida with my oldest daughter when she was in middle school, I think. I was about this deep. Beautiful, clear water. I could see my feet. She was swimming, and she had her back to the Gulf. We're looking at some ships, and all of a sudden, whew, there goes the fin. I'm like, I watched Shark Week way too much. And she's like, what? I'm like, nothing. She goes, no, what? And there it was again. Whew. And I'm like, and then she started climbing my head. Have you ever done that to your dad? I mean, and I'm like going down and she's on top of me. It was a dolphin, thank goodness. Which turned out to be cool, but then I was like, okay, I didn't see them. Let's go. Dorsal. So whether it's anterior, posterior, ventral dorsal. That's referring to the front or back of your patient. Now, this is where it can get confusing too, because sometimes individuals will refer to this as anterior, the top of your head, and posterior toward your feet. That sort of works for most animals, specifically four-legged animals. That would be correct for that terminology. But for bipedal organisms, and those that are principally bipedal, I know that some chimpanzees and other primates can walk on two legs. Bears can do that sometimes. You see YouTube videos of cats that do that. But no, primarily bipedal, we use superior and inferior. And again, these are going to be regional terms because the brain is superior to the lungs. Do you see that orientation? Superior is always toward the head. Medial and lateral. Medial is along the midline of the body. So if we talk about the heart in its position, the heart is going to be medial. Your wrist is going to be lateral. And so as you move in those directions, that's lateral. As you move back toward the middle of the body, that will be medial. Now, lateral and medial can also sometimes be used synonymously with these next two, proximal and distal. So the heart is medial, right? But as we move out on our arms and out on our legs, we can also talk about proximal and distal. The shoulder is more proximal to the body. Your fingers are more distal. But do you see how that sort of relates to medial and lateral as well? So you can use those terms in very similar ways, but really appendages, arms and legs, proximal and distal, medial and lateral, more the trunk of the body. All right. Are we good with orientations? This is going to be very, very important as you are talking to patients, as you are looking at certain radiographic measures, x-rays, MRIs. And some of those are going to be really, really tricky because you're not looking at the whole body. You're looking at sections of the body. And so when you think about how x-rays and MRIs and CAT scans can, either with radiation or with electronics, slice through the body, we're going to look principally at three planes, and you can see our three dimensions represented here. So the sagittal plane, which is in red, that basically is going to slice the body into right and left portions. Now, if that plane is directly down the medial portion of the body, the midline of the body, that's going to equally divide you into right and left equal portions. That's called a mid-sagittal plane. Anything that is off the midline in either right or left direction often is referred to as parasagittal. But just the generic term sagittal refers to that division into right and left. Now, some textbooks call this next one frontal. And I can sort of see how you would get that. Because this plane of section, if you could think of a big knife cutting through your body, this is going to divide you along the blue plane into ventral and dorsal portions, or anterior, posterior portions. But again, sort of old classical anatomical terms, I like the term coronal section. Now, I sometimes ask my class to help me define corona. This is a big class, so I know I'm going to get that definition, and you know what I'm talking about, and it's not beer. Okay, what does corona mean? It's derived from the word crown. And a lot of times when you place a crown on your head, your hands are beside your temples like this. So I like to think of that plane of section, and that helps me remember that coronal section coming down, dividing into ventral and dorsal portions. Now, if we're going to cut the body into superior and inferior halves, this is a transverse section. Some refer to it as a horizontal section. almost layman terms, think of cross-section. And so using these three planes, you can get a better understanding of, okay, what exactly am I looking at? Because a coronal x-ray through the lungs is going to look very different than a transverse x-ray through the lungs or a sagittal x-ray. Now, do you think x-ray techs and MRI techs are so good that each and every time they're going to get it exactly in one of these three dimensions? No, it's never going to be exact. And so if it's not one of these three exact planes, we just lump this together into the term called oblique. That's OB. You kind of can't see that first word. An oblique section is any other plane through the body. Maybe more closely related to a sagittal or a transverse, but if it's some sort of interesting angle, we just refer to it as oblique. All right? So hopefully understanding these positional cues and terms we use, understanding the planes, that will help you not only in lab, but when you get to the point of actually your patient care, that will help you. Now, this is where I want to take just a few minutes, not provide you with any information, knowledge that's going to be on the test. But I always, when I'm talking to a class of health professionals, I always want to remind you, and I'll probably do this a lot through the semester, remember you are helping a person, not a disease. This is not about a managed care account number. It's not about some reimbursable amount. It's about helping people. And if you are going into a health profession because you see dollar signs, you see a nice paycheck, you see a nice lifestyle, especially nursing, we need to have a conversation. Because you're going to be paid very well. But it's a lot of hard work. Not every patient you deal with is going to make it. The patients that do make it, I mean, it's really going to be worthwhile. The patients that you can help, that you can comfort, that you can encourage, hopefully that's going to be your reward more than a paycheck. But you got to understand it's about people. And the thing that has encouraged me so much these past few days with the tragedy that's happened in Houston, have you seen on social media the people that are going to help other people? Nobody's checking their voter registration card to see if they're Republican or Democrat. Nobody cares what color their skin is. Nobody cares what gender they proclaim. It's just people helping people. And that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be helping people. And I love this quote from Hippocrates. He's kind of a smart guy, right? Cure sometimes, treat often, and as a nurse, you're going to do those things. But what's that last one? Comfort always. Comfort always. Again, you are embarking on an ambitious career, but a very rewarding career. You're going to be putting in a lot of hours, a lot of time. It's going to be very, very easy for you to lose sight of what it is you're really there to do. And hopefully, if you don't remember anything else from that crazy A&P professor, you will remember the words of someone a lot smarter than me. Comfort always. I mean, that's something we can all apply each and every day. And if we all did that, man, what a great place this would be to live. So let me encourage you to do that. Let me also encourage you as you deal with people to think about what health means. What does it mean to be healthy? Now, for a lot of health professionals, the people you work with are unhealthy folks. These are people that have some disease or some infirmity. Well, being healthy simply doesn't mean the absence of disease. But it means the optimal state of physical, and that's primarily what we're focused on with our chemistry and with our A&Ps and pathophys. But it's also that mental state. That's where the comforting comes in. You encouraging that patient. You loving on that patient. So you need to encourage everyone of the people you encounter to be healthy. Now, what is the best way for you to lead someone to better health? Or what's the best way to lead someone, period? Tell them what to do? Do what? I heard it. By example. By example. The best leaders are the ones that say, follow me. Have you ever been to a doctor and he comes into the room and he's hacking, coughing because he smoked all his life, and he weighs 500 pounds, and the first thing that that doctor says to you is you need to lose weight? Has that ever happened to anybody? I'm just like, who are you to tell me I need to lose weight? Right? You get my point? We need to lead by example. You be the best person you can be, and in doing so, your patients are going to want to be like you. You comfort them the best you can, and in doing so, those people are going to want to comfort others just like you help them. It's like paying it forward. So it's more than just understanding the science. It's having the heart to be a healer and a health professional.